Imagine waking up one day and realizing your entire life was a lie. Your marriage, your children, your family, nothing was what it seemed. Adam Walker thought he had it all. A loving wife, 2 wonderful kids, and a stable life. But a single discovery shattered everything. A hidden truth buried for 15 years. A betrayal so deep it would push him to the edge. What would you do if the people you trusted most had been lying to you all along? This is Adam's story. A journey of deception, revenge, and the fight to rebuild from the ruins. Adam Walker wiped his forehead as he stood amidst the clutter of his attic, sorting through the forgotten remnants of the past. At 39, the high school history teacher still had enough energy to take on weekend projects. Though this particular task, clearing out years of dust-covered memorabilia, had been long overdue. As he shifted a pile of old newspapers, his fingers brushed against something solid. Pulling it free, he found himself holding a weathered leather album, its spine cracked with age. Curiosity piqued. Adam settled onto an old wooden trunk, flipping open the cover. Pages of photographs greeted him, each image capturing fragments of his Irish-American heritage. He smiled faintly, memories flooding back as he turned each page. But then something caught his eye, a recent family portrait. His gaze lingered on his 14-year-old daughter, Claire. She had grown so much, he thought, examining her delicate features. Yet, as he compared her face to an old photograph of himself at the same age, an unease stirred within him. Claire's nose had a subtle curve that he did not recognize. Her eyes, though blue like his, had a distinct almond shape that did not seem to align with the family traits he had always assumed she inherited. He turned the page, studying an image of his 12-year-old son, Ethan. His complexion was slightly darker than Adam's, his hair a deep brown, richer than his own. At first, he dismissed his concerns as overthinking. Genetics could be unpredictable. But as he continued to scrutinize the photos, the feeling of unease grew into something heavier, more difficult to ignore. That night, long after his children had gone to bed, Adam sat alone in his dimly lit study, his laptop open before him. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, before he finally typed the words, DNA test kits. He scrolled through the options, his heartbeat quickening. This was irrational, he told himself. And yet, doubt gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. The soft sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Melissa standing in the doorway, her expression curious. "Still working?" she asked, her voice gentle. Adam forced a casual nod. "Just looking up some resources for class," he replied, quickly closing the laptop screen. She smiled and gave a small nod. "Don't stay up too late," she said before turning away. As soon as she was gone, Adam reopened his laptop and placed an order for 3 DNA test kits. His hands trembled as he confirmed the purchase. What was he hoping to find? Or worse, what was he afraid he might uncover? The days stretched endlessly as he waited for the results. Every breakfast, every conversation with Claire and Ethan took on a new weight. He found himself observing them more closely, searching their faces for something that would either confirm or dispel his growing fears. Yet nothing eased the gnawing anxiety. Then, one evening, as he sat alone at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed. The email had arrived. With a deep breath, Adam opened the results. His own lineage showed precisely what he expected, Irish and other European heritage. But as he scrolled down to Claire and Ethan's results, the air left his lungs. A significant percentage of their DNA was linked to Hispanic ancestry, something that had no place in his family tree. For a long moment, he simply stared at the screen, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. This had to be a mistake, a glitch. But as he reread the information, the truth pressed down on him like an unbearable weight. That night, sleep was impossible. His thoughts raced, circling around one inescapable question. What had Melissa done? The woman he had shared his life with, built a family with, had she been keeping a secret from him all these years? The thought of confronting her sent a wave of nausea through him. He needed more than just test results. He needed proof. By morning, his decision was made. He would not act on impulse. He would not confront her with accusations based only on what the DNA results suggested. Instead, he would uncover the truth with absolute certainty. And so, with a resolve forged from heartbreak and determination, Adam reached for his phone and dialed a number he never imagined he would need. A few hours later, he sat across from Raymond Cole, a private investigator with years of experience in uncovering secrets most people wished to remain buried. Cole leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp with curiosity. "So, what exactly are we looking for here?" Adam exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "I need to know if my wife has been unfaithful. And if she has, I need to know with whom." Cole nodded, jotting down notes. "Do you have any suspicions?" Adam shook his head. "No idea. But my kids, they might not be mine." The words tasted foreign on his tongue, heavy with a sorrow he was not ready to acknowledge. Cole studied him for a moment before setting his pen down. "I'll see what I can find." As Adam walked out of the investigator's office and into the bright afternoon sun, he felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The life he had believed in, the foundation upon which he had built his family, was now riddled with cracks. And though he did not yet have all the answers, he knew one thing for certain. His world was about to change forever. Adam Walker sat in his car outside the private investigator's office, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. The sun was dipping below the horizon, stretching the shadows across the parking lot, but he barely noticed. His thoughts cycled relentlessly, replaying moments of his marriage, searching for any detail that now seemed out of place. Had Melissa always been hiding something, or had he been blind to the truth? Steeling himself, he stepped out of the car and walked into the dimly lit office. Raymond Cole, the investigator, sat behind a desk cluttered with paperwork, his face unreadable as he slid a stack of photographs forward. Adam picked them up, his stomach twisting at the sight. Melissa was in the arms of another man, the two of them locked in an embrace that spoke of familiarity, not just passion. Adam didn't need to be told who he was looking at. The resemblance to Claire and Ethan was undeniable. Antonio Vega, a name he had never given much thought to before, but now it was seared into his mind as the final piece of a deception that had lasted for years. The investigator laid out the details methodically. Hotel stays, financial transactions, years of emails exchanged in secret. 15 years. The number echoed in Adam's mind. This wasn't an affair that had happened in the shadows of their marriage. It had existed from the beginning. His hands trembled as he closed the folder, trying to steady his breath. By the time he pulled up to his parents' house later that evening, his body was running on adrenaline and disbelief. He needed answers, needed to understand if the people closest to him had known. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of his mother's cooking filled the air, but it did nothing to soothe him. The weight of the photographs in his jacket pocket felt heavier with each step. His family was gathered in the living room, his mother fussing over a tray of tea while his father leaned back in his chair, unread newspaper in hand. Victoria and David, his siblings, sat nearby, the casual conversation fading as soon as they noticed his expression. He told them everything. The DNA results, the investigation, the truth about Melissa and Antonio. Silence filled the room when he was done, but it wasn't the stunned silence he had expected. It was a silence of guilt, of withheld words. His mother looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray. His father shifted uncomfortably. It was Victoria who finally spoke, her voice hesitant, careful. She admitted they had known for a while. Not the entire time, but long enough. Adam barely heard the explanations that followed, justifications that felt weak in the face of what they had kept from him. They had believed it was better this way. They had thought he was happy. They had convinced themselves that ignorance was a form of protection. His father murmured something about how difficult it had been, how they hadn't wanted to be the ones to shatter his life. His mother's eyes glistened as she reached out for him, her voice pleading for him to understand. Victoria and David tried to reason with him, offering their own regrets, their own guilt over not saying something sooner. But none of it mattered. They had known. They had watched him build a life on a lie, watched him raise children that weren't his, and they had chosen to stay silent. Adam pushed himself up from the chair, ignoring their voices calling after him. He barely registered the sound of the door closing behind him as he stepped into the cold evening air. His breath came sharp, his hands clenched into fists. He had come looking for clarity, for comfort. Instead, he had found betrayal in places he had never thought to look. As he walked toward his car, the weight of the night pressed down on him. His wife, his children, his own blood, every pillar of his life had cracked. And now, standing beneath the flickering streetlights, he understood something with a clarity that cut deeper than anger. He was completely, utterly alone. Adam Walker sat in his study, staring at the dim glow of his laptop screen. Sleep had eluded him for days. Every time he closed his eyes, the images returned. The photographs of Melissa in Antonio's arms, the DNA results that shattered his identity, the quiet guilt in his mother's eyes when she admitted what they had kept from him. His entire world had been rewritten in a matter of weeks, and he was left grasping for control over what little remained. He knew he couldn't sit idly by, drowning in resentment. He needed action, something to channel the fury clawing at his chest. Revenge was an obvious course, but it needed to be precise, deliberate. Blind rage would accomplish nothing. He reached for the folder Raymond Cole had given him, flipping through pages of evidence. Antonio Vega wasn't just a man who had stolen his wife. He was a businessman, someone with a reputation, someone with vulnerabilities. The financial records were the most damning. Cole had uncovered irregularities in Antonio's construction company. Off-the-books transactions, falsified invoices, misreported earnings. Fraud. Adam didn't need to know much about corporate law to understand what this meant. If the right people got hold of this information, Antonio's empire would crumble. He hesitated for only a moment before sending an anonymous report to the authorities. The IRS, the city's fraud investigation unit, he made sure the evidence landed in all the right inboxes. When he pressed send, there was no immediate sense of satisfaction, only a cold, calculated certainty that the wheels had been set in motion. But financial ruin alone wasn't enough. Melissa had spent years lying to him, playing the devoted wife while building a separate life behind his back. She had been comfortable, secure, never fearing consequences. That too had to change. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Adam had hired the best attorney he could find, Gregory Shaw, a man with a reputation for ensuring his clients walked away with everything. Melissa fought at first, but the weight of evidence against her was insurmountable. The judge ruled in Adam's favor. Full custody of the children, the house, the assets. Melissa was left with the bare minimum, forced to carve out a life on her own without the comfort of their shared resources. She had once been a respected professional in human resources. Now, with the scandal of her affair publicly known and her husband's aggressive legal strategy leaving her financially drained, job offers were scarce. Adam didn't take pleasure in it, but he didn't feel sympathy either. He had spent 15 years believing in a family that never truly existed. Whatever Melissa faced now, it was of her own making. Meanwhile, the school board had become a secondary battlefield. The proposed changes to the history curriculum had stirred something within him, something beyond his personal turmoil. The alterations aimed to sanitize historical events, removing uncomfortable truths in favor of a more acceptable narrative. It was dishonest, and after everything he had been through, Adam had no patience left for lies. He spent his days rallying fellow teachers, speaking to parents, drafting petitions. What had once been a passive frustration turned into an all-out campaign. Meetings grew larger, voices grew louder, and soon, the administration had no choice but to acknowledge the resistance. The fight at school gave him purpose, a distraction from the wreckage of his personal life. Yet, at home, his children watched him with uncertainty. Claire, once so bright and carefree, had grown withdrawn. Ethan avoided conversations, as if afraid of what might spill out if they spoke too openly. They had sensed the shift in their father, the quiet fury that had settled into his presence. One evening, as Adam sat reviewing his notes for the upcoming school board meeting, Claire appeared in the doorway. She hesitated before speaking, her voice softer than usual. "You've changed," she said simply. He looked up, startled by the observation. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her he was the same father he had always been. But he couldn't lie to her, not after everything. Instead, he said, "I'm trying to make things right." She nodded but didn't seem convinced. After a moment, she left, and Adam was left staring at the empty space where she had stood, a gnawing sense of unease settling in his chest. The revenge was methodical. The battle at school was righteous. But what was he fighting for now? Justice or simply a sense of control? Weeks later, the consequences of his actions unfolded. News broke of financial misconduct at Antonio Vega's company. Investigations were launched, assets frozen, contracts pulled. Antonio went from a respected businessman to a pariah overnight. Melissa's life continued its downward spiral. Unable to maintain her previous lifestyle, she moved into a small apartment, her reputation in ruins. At school, Adam's campaign against the history curriculum changes succeeded. The board relented, shelving the proposed revisions after mounting public pressure. His colleagues praised his leadership. Parents thanked him for fighting for their children's education. He had won. Yet, standing in the middle of his quiet house, surrounded by victory on every front, Adam felt nothing. The anger had sustained him for so long, but now, with everything settled, all that remained was exhaustion. He had spent so much time tearing things down. His marriage, Antonio's career, the lies in the school system. But what had he built? His children still looked at him differently. His home felt colder. His future, once clear, now stretched before him in uncertainty. Revenge had been the easy part. Now he had to figure out what came next. Adam Walker stepped out of the moving truck, taking in the quiet street of his new neighborhood. The house before him was smaller than the one he had left behind, but it felt different, lighter, unburdened by ghosts of betrayal. He had sold the old house, the place where his marriage had crumbled, and used the money to start fresh. His children, Claire and Ethan, were hesitant about the change, but they hadn't fought him on it. They were still adjusting just as he was. The past months had been a whirlwind. The divorce had finalized. The scandal surrounding Antonio Vega had played out in the media, leaving his once thriving business in ruins. Melissa had vanished from public view, reduced to a shadow of the woman she once was. Adam had moved on, not in the sense of forgetting, but in the sense of refusing to let the past dictate his future. Settling into his new life, he accepted a position as a school principal at a private academy. It was an unexpected shift, but the opportunity had come at the right time. His reputation as a teacher who had fought for academic integrity had opened doors he hadn't considered before. The work kept him busy, and for the first time in months, his focus wasn't on revenge but on rebuilding. Yet, despite the structure of his new life, something remained unsettled. His children were growing distant. Claire, once so eager to talk, had retreated into herself. Ethan spent more time in his room, barely acknowledging his father's attempts at conversation. They weren't angry with him, not exactly, but they had seen too much, felt too much. The weight of everything that had happened lingered in the air between them. One evening, as Adam sat alone at the dining table, a thought struck him. He had spent so much time dismantling the lies around him that he had forgotten to create something in their place. He had torn apart the life he thought he had, but what had he built in its absence? On impulse, he researched local community groups. He found one, a support group for those who had gone through betrayal and divorce. It met at a nearby community center, and before he could second-guess himself, he signed up. The first meeting was small. A handful of people sat in a circle, their expressions a mixture of guarded curiosity and quiet pain. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated. He had spent months consumed by anger, by action. He hadn't stopped to process. "My wife had an affair for 15 years, he said finally. "The man she was with is the biological father of my children." The words felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else's story. But as he spoke, the burden on his chest eased, if only slightly. Others shared their own experiences, stories of betrayal, of rebuilding, of learning to trust again. Over the weeks, Adam kept attending. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something about being among people who understood made it easier to breathe. It was there that he met Isabel. She was another teacher working at a nearby high school. Her own story was different. Her husband had left her for someone else after nearly 2 decades of marriage. They had no children, but the loss had cut just as deep. She spoke with quiet strength, her words measured, thoughtful. At first, their conversations were brief, small exchanges after meetings, passing remarks about the absurdities of the education system. But soon they grew longer. They met for coffee after sessions, then outside of them. Isabel challenged him, asked him questions that forced him to reflect. One evening, after a particularly heavy discussion about their pasts, they walked in silence through a quiet park. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching beneath their feet. "I don't think I know how to start over," Adam admitted. It was the first time he had said it out loud. Isabel glanced at him, a soft smile on her lips. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," she said. "Just take one step, and then another." It wasn't profound, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. Their relationship unfolded slowly. It wasn't a rush of passion or desperate longing. It was careful, deliberate, built on trust that neither of them had expected to find again. Adam had spent so long believing in something false that he had forgotten what honesty felt like. His children noticed the change. Claire, always observant, was the first to ask about Isabel. "Is she your girlfriend?" she asked one evening as they cleared the dinner table. Adam hesitated before answering. "She's someone I care about." Claire didn't push for more, but there was a shift in her expression. Something softer, something accepting. Ethan took longer to warm up, but eventually, he let his father see a glimpse of the boy he used to be, before their lives had been turned upside down. As the months passed, Adam found himself settling into something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not closure, not yet, but the beginnings of something real. The past still lingered. It always would. But for the first time in a long time, Adam wasn't looking backward. He was looking ahead. 5 years had passed since Adam Walker had uncovered the truth that shattered his world. 5 years since he had lost the illusion of his perfect family and begun the painstaking process of rebuilding. The scars remained, but they no longer defined him. Claire was now 19, thriving in college, carving out a future for herself. Ethan, 17, had grown into a confident young man, his sharp mind and unwavering sense of justice making him a leader among his peers. They had both come through the storm, carrying pieces of it with them but refusing to let it dictate their futures. Adam had found stability in his career. As a principal, he had the influence to shape the education system in a way that aligned with his values. His fight for historical accuracy in the curriculum had earned him both admiration and resistance, but he had learned to navigate those battles without letting them consume him. Most importantly, he had found love again. Isabel had become an integral part of his life, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as something entirely new, something built on honesty and understanding. They had taken their time, cautious but committed. She had met his children, earned their trust, and over time had become family. Then, one autumn morning, the past came knocking. Adam was in his office at the academy when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, but something in his gut told him to pick up. "Adam." The voice on the other end was hesitant, laced with something unspoken. "It's Rachel, Melissa's sister." He hadn't heard from her in years. He leaned back in his chair, bracing himself. "What is it?" A pause. Then, finally, "It's Melissa. She's gone." The words didn't sink in right away. He waited for the usual flood of emotions, the rush of anger, betrayal, regret. But all he felt was a quiet stillness. Rachel explained the details: an undiagnosed heart condition. She had passed in her sleep. The funeral was in a few days. The question hung unspoken between them. Would he and the children come? That evening, Adam sat with Claire and Ethan in their living room. He told them the news gently, watching their faces for signs of emotion. Claire's lips parted slightly, processing. Ethan looked down, his fingers twisting the hem of his sleeve. "Do you think we should go?" Claire finally asked. Adam sighed. "I think that's something you both need to decide for yourselves. You don't owe anyone anything." They sat in silence for a moment before Claire nodded. "I want to go." Ethan hesitated but then nodded as well. "Me too." The day of the funeral was gray and cold. The cemetery was quiet, the small gathering solemn. Adam stood beside his children, his hands in his coat pockets. He listened as the priest spoke, but his mind drifted, caught between memories. Melissa as she had once been, bright-eyed, full of charm, the woman he had fallen for all those years ago, the woman who had betrayed him, the woman he had once loved. Rachel approached them after the service, her face lined with exhaustion. She thanked them for coming, her eyes lingering on Claire and Ethan with something close to relief. "She never stopped loving them," she said quietly. "She regretted everything." Adam nodded but said nothing. He wasn't here to reconcile the past. He was here because Claire and Ethan had needed this, because saying goodbye to their mother was part of their story, whether he liked it or not. As they left the cemetery, he glanced at his children, seeing in them a resilience that made him proud. They had survived just as he had. That night, as they sat together at home, Claire broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if none of this had happened?" Adam considered the question carefully. "If none of this had happened," he said finally, "we wouldn't be who we are now." She nodded, seeming to understand. Ethan exhaled, stretching his legs out in front of him. "I guess we turned out okay."
Adam chuckled.
"Yeah, we did." Later, as he stood on the porch, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Isabel joined him. She slipped her hand into his, a silent show of support. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He turned to her, squeezing her fingers gently. "Yeah," he said, and for the first time in a long time he truly meant it. The past had shaped him, but it no longer controlled him. He had found love, purpose, and most importantly, peace. As he looked at the home he had built, not the walls but the life within them, he knew with certainty he wouldn't change a thing.